This is Nick Christopher from Mob Tales. Thanks for tuning in. Please share, like, and subscribe and all that fun stuff. Today, I'm very privileged to have an award-winning author, fellow mob expert, great writer, and I love all his work, George Anastasia. Thanks a lot for coming on, my friend. It's a pleasure.
Nick, thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Sure. Well, my first question would be, obviously, how did writing become a passion for you? When did that start?
I guess it started while I was in college. I was a foreign exchange student for 2 different semesters and started reading newspapers every day. That was the way. This is back in the '60s, a way to connect with what was going on back home. And I got fascinated with newspapers at that point. Got out of school, got a job as a sports writer, spent a year doing that, and then I segued over to news, and it just kind of evolved from there. And I was fortunate. I got hired by the Philadelphia Inquirer, 1974, and was sent to cover the dawn of casino gambling in Atlantic City in 1976. And organized crime was always a part of that story. And I started to write more and more about the mob in conjunction with Atlantic City, and then just segued into almost exclusively mob stuff.
Well, you said you were a foreign exchange student. So you were born in Italy?
No. I was born in Philadelphia, and I grew up in
Ah,
New Jersey. Yeah.
okay. No, 'cause you mentioned foreign exchange. That's why I figured.
No. I was a student in college, and they sent me. I got a chance to go to France, so I spent two
Oh,
semesters.
nice. Okay. All right. Very good. Um, so obviously that's like you just said, as you just explained, uh, covering the gambling situation in Jersey, in Atlantic City. So I guess that kind of triggered where you became a mob writer, mob journalist, and covering that genre. Um,
I remember it was kind of ironic. Part of the big debate back then when they wanted to legalize casinos, they would say, is legalized gaming? They never called it gambling. Is legalized gaming going to bring the mob to Atlantic City? Well, the mob already was in Atlantic City. I mean, it was part of the
yeah.
fabric down there, and it became part of what I was writing about.
When, if you recall, one of your first writing, one of your first coverages in that genre, um, do you recall the response that you received, the kind of response from the public? How did that come about?
Well, I mean, I think one of the first mob-related incidents was the murder of a municipal judge in a local, the Flamingo Lounge. He had double-crossed Nicky Scarfo and Nick Virgilio in a trying to fix a case, and when Virgilio got out, they killed him. And that was one of the first, I guess, major mob stories I wrote in Atlantic City. And um, here's the thing that struck me about writing about organized crime, and the more I did it, the more I kind of realized it. Not everybody cares about it. Not everybody wants to read about it, but those that do can't get enough. It's like if you're a sports writer and you're writing about baseball, not everybody cares, but the ones that do want to read about it every day. It was the same thing with organized crime, especially in that time frame, the '70s and '80s. There was so much going on. So there was a locked-in readership, and this was a question of, addressing that readership, talking about those stories. And I was fortunate to be at the Philadelphia Inquirer at a time when there were a lot of resources. It was a big staff. We had a lot of money, and I was able to just go do what I wanted to do. And there was always an editor who said, "Yeah, that's great. Keep doing it."
Well, in comparison to, before we get deep into that subject, but in comparison to sports writing, because that's where you started, to doing this,
Yeah.
which do you prefer writing about?
I prefer I prefer this because it's I think closer to reality. I mean, sports is a fantasy for a lot of people, and there's a there's a limited number of people who can be involved. Other than that, you're just a voyeur. You're watching. Um, and with organized crime, I think a lot of people, again, are fascinated with it for whatever reason. And the other thing that I thought I brought to the table was my grandparents came to this country from Sicily, and Sicilians have always gotten a bad rap about the mafia, etc. And I thought, who better to write about it and give it some perspective than somebody who comes from the same place. Um, my grandparents, my parents were never involved in organized crime, but they grew up in South Philadelphia. The mob was always a part of an institution, if you will, in South Philly, and it was
Mhm.
part of the experience. It wasn't who they were, but it was a part of where they came from. And I tried to bring some of that to writing about it. I didn't want to glamorize this life, but I also wanted to be fair and present the story. And the stories are rich. I mean, so many times I would be involved in something, and I say to myself, you can't make this up any better than it is. There just was so much going on, and I was very fortunate, right place at the right time.
Well, being the fact that you're from Sicily, your family's from there, um, and let alone with the name Anastasia, last name of all names. I'm sure you got some rap for that. Oh, were you related to Albert? I'm sure you got that.
Tell you what, Nick, in Philadelphia, I didn't hear about that. When I would go up to New York to work on stories, I would always get that question. Philadelphia, or they didn't make the connection. I don't know. And I've tried to do some research about that. And Albert Anastasia, the best I could determine was he was from Calabria, not from Sicily. But Calabria is just right across the Strait of Messina from Sicily. So there's a good chance if we traced it all the way back, we probably would be connected in some way.
That's crazy. It's a crazy thought to begin with. Uh, well, being Sicilian, Italian, I'm sure some writers have got some slack. Oh, why are you writing about this subject? You're making us look bad. Have you ever got that at all?
Absolutely, Nick. I mean, it was something I dealt with on a kind of a regular basis, and it was, you're reinforcing the stereotype. You're writing about it, and everybody thinks we're gangsters. And I, by 1980, by 1990, I mean, I had trouble understanding how people would feel that way. To me, it became like a crutch. They want to be a victim. Um, I think, and this is what I would say. I mean, at that particular time, I remember having this discussion with even people in my own family, in fact, the 1990s. And I said, the most important job in the United States is president. But next to that, the most important is being on the Supreme Court. And at that time, there are only 9 justices. 2 of them were Italians, Samuel Alito and Anton Scalia. I said, so we've arrived. We're there, Italian Americans can do and be whatever they want to be. So don't use that as a crutch. But people still do. I mean, the idea of victimhood is something that's embraced by almost every cultural and ethnic group in this country at some point or another to kind of use as leverage to get what they want. And so Italian American groups continue to do that. But I had to deal with it, and I tried to play straight and fair, but not everybody accepted that.
Yeah, that happens. It's true. I know. I got it also.
Yeah.
Uh, now covering the Philly mob, which you did for a long time,
Yeah.
and I read all of your books, and they're all incredible. Really like everyone. Uh, the Philly mob, of course, went through a lot of transitions. From the Angelo Bruno days to the Scarfo days to Joe and Gamby, John Stamper, all that stuff. Um, and you covered a lot of those
Yeah.
time periods. Um, would you say the scarf of all the ones you've written about, would you say the Scarfo era was the most violent, the most a lot more to write about because there was always something going on.
Scarfo was a psychopath, and he brought that kind of management style to what he was doing. So yeah, it was a crazy time. There seemed like there were bodies dropping constantly. So there was always that to write about. But I think the most fascinating was the John Stanfa era. Stanfa became the boss, and
Hmm.
FBI put a bug in his lawyer's office, and for like 2 years, they were listening in during this mob war between Stanfa and Joey Merlino, and I was able to get access to a lot of that stuff. So, I mean, if you look at the Philadelphia crime family, and today it's very, very small and not very active. But if you look at what happened in Philadelphia from Bruno to today, I think it's a microcosm of what happened to the American mafia. I mean, it's electronic surveillance, cooperating witnesses, and the RICO law. All those three things combined was like a perfect storm, and that's why the mob's been decimated in Philadelphia and elsewhere in the country. But Philadelphia was, from my perspective, it was easier to get my arms around Philadelphia because it wasn't that big. I mean, Jerry Capisi, God bless him, he's got to cover 5 crime families in New York, plus what's going on in Newark. That's a massive undertaking. I have Philadelphia. Never been, uh, I, New York's the major leagues. Philadelphia's always been AAA, and it was easy to get my arms around what was going on. There weren't at its high point. Probably there were 80 members. At other times there were 30 to 40 members. So it's easier to keep track of these guys. And the other thing that really was played to my benefit, it seems like there was always somebody wearing a wire. So there were, you write nonfiction and you say, well, the problem when you write nonfiction is where you're going to get your dialogue. I always had dialogue because somebody will always wire it up. And eventually those tapes were used as evidence and they became public record. So Philadelphia, in addition to being probably during my period covering them, one of the most dysfunctional mob families in America, they were also probably one of the most recorded. And that was a treasure trove for me. It really was. It helped in writing books. It helped in writing newspaper articles, magazine pieces, because you had dialogue.
So outside of Scarpa, would you say the John Stamper, Ralph Natale days were kind of like the writing on the wall? This is going down. This is going to crumble.
Good point, Nick. You could see if you trace from Bruno to those guys, it was a steady decline. And Scarfo kind of, because of his wanton violence, kind of speeded the process along. But then after that, it was the gang that couldn't shoot straight, the gang that couldn't think straight, and the whole FBI's recording it all and getting it all on tape. So, there were some fascinating cooperating witnesses. Ronnie Previty, I wrote a book about, was a fascinating guy. Nick Caramondi in the Scarfo era. There always was somebody
Yeah,
coming.
Phil Leonetti.
Leonetti, another one. Yeah. So, I mean, it just went on and on and on. Philadelphia per capita probably had more cooperators than any other crime family in America. You think about it. And that was the end of Omerta. The code of silence was gone. And, these guys, some of them, it's a generational thing too. The old time guys like Bruno, uh, they really believed in this whole thing. I think they really believed in the mafia as a way of life. For the younger guys, the mafia became a way to make money. And when they got jammed up, and it's a business, how do you cut your losses? You raise your hand and you
Yeah.
make. It's not about omerta. It's about how do I save my ass? And the business and not. I don't believe in it as an institution, as a culture. I don't embrace that. Yeah, I'm going to cut a deal, and it happens again and again and again.
Well, I'm going to ask you a crazy question. Now we have somebody who's still out on whether he's active or not, nobody knows. It's really mystery to me. Our good friend Skinny Merlino, who's got his own podcast.
Yeah.
Now, what is your take on this character, who's to me, he's one of the most manipulative guys I've ever seen.
Yeah, Joey is very charismatic, but at the end of the day, Joey's always been for Joey. And I think he just decided the best way to go was, to basically what he's done is made himself into a brand and he's marketing himself. And, I've never talked to him directly about this, but I've talked to guys who know him. And he got very frustrated and angry with cooperators who we saw cashing in. Guys like Sammy Gravano, like guys like Michael Franzese. Franzese does a great job with his show, but clearly, he's coming from the perspective of I'm out of that life now. I was what I was, but now here's the skin. Here's what it's really like. And Joey sees all of this and sees the number of hits they're getting and saying, why are they making money? Why aren't we making money? And I think Joey just decided that's the way he's going to go. Now, is he out of the life? Can you ever get out of the life? I don't know. Um, he's given up being the godfather to be the podfather. That's what it comes down to.
That's interesting. But the question is, see, I've talked to a lot of different people. Some
Yeah,
people say, yeah, he's still active. Other people say, how's that possible if he's doing a show? It's like a boss wouldn't be doing a show. So
exactly.
who's running the farm?
No, no, I think you're right. I don't think Joey cares. I don't think he cares. I don't think he wants to be boss anymore. If you look at Philadelphia from the Angelo Bruno era to the present, every mob boss ended up either dead or in jail. So what's the point of being a boss? And I think he reached, he spent a lot of time in jail. He's what, 61, 62. He's probably spent half his adult life in jail. And I think he decided enough was enough. I'm going to go this route. And he also creates, a couple of people have said this. He's created a legal defense should he ever get indicted again, basically saying, I gave up that life. I walked away from it. And
You and I both know you can't walk away from that life.
you know, that's true anymore, Nick. I don't know if that's true anymore. I think the whole world has been turned upside down, and you know, I don't think you can apply 1960s, 1970s regulations and rules and protocols to the 2024 American Cosa Nostra. It's just not. It's not what it used to be. Never will be. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. But I think some of us, and I guess I'm as guilty of this as anybody. Some of us cling to that. It was so much better, so much more interesting back then, and I think it was. But by and large, I think it's over. I mean, here's the thing, Nick. I made a career out of being kind of the middleman between the public that wanted this stuff and the wise guys that were out there doing this stuff. And today, there's no need for a middleman anymore. You got guys like Franzese and Gravano going on talking about their world, their life, what it was like. And now you got Joey jumping in the same fashion, you know, giving his perspective on what it was all about. Now, is it better or is it worse? I would argue there are no filters anymore. So, how do you, as the public, how do you know what's true and what's not? How do you know who's spinning you, who's not? Whereas when the newspapers were doing their job and doing what they needed to do, there always was a filter. I couldn't just write what I wanted to write. I had to be able to back up what I was saying. I had editors that are saying, how do you know this? Can we be sure of this? Uh, with these podcasts, everything's in play and you just put it out there. And a lot of people are just gobbling it up, and fine if that's what they want. It's not the way I would want it, but as I said, my time has passed. I couldn't do today what I did 20, 30 years ago. There would be no need for me.
Well, good point that you're making now. Now we have a mutual friend that we both have worked with at one time. It was just Johnny A. Life. And now John, so like you just said, he had his own show. He was saying telling his stories, stuff like that. And when when you put out Gotti's Rules with John, I know that you guys had got some slack from the Gotti family and blah blah blah. Just like I did when I put my book out with him, Prison Rules. Um, how did you deal with that kind of pushback from them?
Well, yeah, there's a couple of things. One, John is, I really like John. John is
Me too.
he's a genuine tough guy. Um, Look, I understand from the Gotti's perspective, you, you love your father. He is what he is. I think they tend to glamorize who John Gotti Sr. was. Uh, in a lot of ways, I think he did to the Gambino family what Scarfo did to the Philadelphia family.
Yeah, I kind of agree. Yeah.
Drove it into the ground. But we can argue back and forth about all of that stuff, who he was, what he. Here's the thing I always come back to when people are trying to uh, glamorize John Gotti Sr. Ask the family of John Favara what they think of John Gotti Sr. Ask
Mhm.
what they think about the man's man. You know, you know who John Favara was.
Sure, I do.
I mean, I mean that was that took this whole concept of organized crime and took it in a whole different direction. That was very personal. And look, and I can understand as a parent how you feel, if you lose a child.
Mhm.
But to what degree do you hold somebody responsible when it was an accident? How does that solve anything? And what does it say about you? So yeah, I mean, we can go around and around, and John and I did go around and around with people who were upset about what he said and what I wrote. But that's the name of the game. What are you going to do? But let's don't lose sight of who everybody is in the scheme of things. You know.
Well, what is your concept, or not your concept, but your opinion of like some guys like John, like Phil Leonetti, like Phil Narducci, all these guys that turned state's evidence, and people call them rats and stuff like that. I mean, I defended John many times, telling people, do your due diligence, find out why he did what he did. You didn't live in his shoes to know what he went through. So people are always judging these guys that do this. What is your thought pattern on that?
You know, but Narducci wasn't a cooperative, but the others you mentioned were. Look, every guy decides on his own what what he wants to do and why he wants to do it, and invariably, everybody has a justification. It's human nature, and some of them it's legitimate, some of them is an excuse. Um, I think what's gotten lost is this whole concept of what does it mean to be a man, to be a stand-up guy.
Hmm.
I mean to be a stand-up guy when you're in that life and then all of a sudden everybody in that life is ready to put you 6 feet under. Who do you stand up to, or how do you stand up to them? And I think some of these guys, I mean, I wrote a book about Ronnie Previty, an ex-Philadelphia cop, who
Hmm.
said to me, listen, um, I would have loved to have been a gangster in the 1950s, but the time I got there, it was over. And he would say again and again, he would say, you had to be Ray Charles not to see it. It wasn't about honor or loyalty anymore. It was greed and treachery, and every man for himself. And that's what was going on. So, you know, the point you make is a good one. Each one of these guys, you got to evaluate on an individual basis. Why did they do what they did? What was their alternative? And where did it take them? And there's no easy, simple answer to any of that.
There's somebody I want to bring up to you. I'm not sure if you remember who he is, but he's a friend of mine actually, and he's serving a life term. He's from the Philly crew. He was with John Stamper, I believe. His name is Nicky Slick DiPietro.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you're familiar with his case.
A
And
little bit, yeah.
he's been inside for 24 years. And I mean, I'm friends with the guy, and I went to visit him, and I looked up his trial, I read up his transcripts and everything, and I definitely genuinely think he was framed, sort of like almost like a Whitey Bulger case, almost. I'm sure you're familiar with it.
A little bit. I mean, I haven't done a lot about it, but I think part of the problem is in the greater scheme of things, he was not a major player, so he can easily get lost in the system and get lost in terms of people's interest. I think that's partly what happened to him. Um, for his family, for him, sure, it's a major issue, but for others, you know, it wasn't that big a deal, and so nobody paid that much attention to it. I don't know how I mean, there are. I think literally there are hundreds of people in prison that shouldn't be there, and he might be one of them. Or there are others who have more than paid their debt back to society, and they probably ought to get out now. There's a guy in Philadelphia now, George Mortorano, did 32
Yes, I know he is.
or convicted as a drug kingpin. There's a whole question about why that happened and how it happened and should it have happened. So yeah, these things go on and on and on, and um, you know, as it evolves, I guess, you know, one of the things that has happened is that the media doesn't pay that much attention anymore. Yeah.
No, that's true.
I mean, because, you know, the media's lost resources, lost uh, numbers. It just, particularly the newspaper business, it's a dinosaur. It doesn't, they don't pay the same attention that I was able to pay 20 years ago. It's just the reality of what it is. So these kind of things fall through the cracks. I don't know that there's a solution to any of that.
Right. Well, so in your opinion, the mob in generally is on the way out, more or less. I mean, they're still operational, as
And
far as I know.
I think it's always going to exist. but I don't think it's going to be the monolithic player it was, say, in the 40s and 50s. Other groups are sliding in and becoming more dominant. I
Well,
think the
who do you think is taking over?
well, no, no. I think the last couple of years I was at the Inquirer, I spent more time writing about drug gangs than I did about organized crime. And then, sitting in the shadows is Russian organized crime, Asian organized crime. The problem is, does any one of those groups that even want to reach the level that the mafia once was involved in? I think, so much of it is history. It goes all the way back to Prohibition. Prohibition created an opportunity for Italian and Jewish and Irish gangsters who, they were part of that great immigrant flux into America at the turn of the last century. And they were denied because, there were ethnic bias and racial bias and anti-Semitism. A lot of opportunities were denied them. And Prohibition opened the door. Here's a way to make serious money and to make it in conjunction with politicians and law enforcement. Everybody winking and nod, it's going to happen. Well, after Prohibition ended, those connections remained. And those ethnic groups, particularly the Jews and the Italians, continued to flourish in organized crime and expanded, became racketeers, got involved in all kind of stuff. I don't see that opportunity happening here now. I mean, drugs is the equivalent of alcohol back then, but who's going to legalize drugs? I don't think anybody.
Yeah, good point.
And this war on drugs. I don't know what the answer is, but that's where the money is. Serious, serious money. And a lot of these organizations are making serious money doing that. And it's to the detriment of society.
And so what is George Anastasia working on now that we should be aware of?
No, I'm, I'm still doing some freelance writing, uh, trying to do some work with some documentary people, but everything's still in flux. And I hope I got at least one more book in me. I'm playing around with a couple ideas and maybe taking a look back at Philadelphia back at a different period. But I'm pretty happy where I am. I'm no heavy lifting. You know what I mean, Nick? I'm retired and enjoying it, so it's all good.
Okay, I mean, if the book that you said you still got in you,
I
is there anything you can share with us? Any ideas that that we should that would tweak our interest?
take a serious look at Angelo Bruno.
Ah,
I mean, a lot's been written about him, but I don't know that anybody's really gotten uh, who really was he and how did he get to where he was. So I'm thinking about doing that. I'm playing with that idea. We'll
oh,
see.
that'd be interesting. Sure. Okay. Well, listen, George, I really appreciate you coming on. I know you and I can probably talk forever about this. Um, I mean, I did want to ask you something minor. I know it's not a major thing, but I know you covered it a little bit in Philadelphia. You covered my people, the Greek mob. I know you covered that a little bit. And they'll talk about guys who never ratted. They never did.
Stevie Boris was a major player, and that I mentioned George Mortorano. His father, Long John Mortorano, and Stevie Boris were both in the meth trade. Uh, this was a group that didn't get a lot of attention, but at one point was a significant player in the underworld. Uh, and
And John is the one who set him up, correct?
yeah, that was a very infamous hit at the Miletus restaurant in South Philadelphia. And Stevie Boris and his date that night, a woman, were killed in it.
Yeah, Jeanette Kuro.
Yeah, right. And it was, I think, all went back to the meth business and who was dominating, who was controlling. And that goes back to what we just said a minute ago. Drugs, drugs create a whole different dynamic. The money is so unbelievably big that people kind of lose sight of what it's all about.
Was
But nobody's paid really good attention, I think, to the Greek mob in Philadelphia.
was Nicky Scarfo Jr. part of that hit?
I don't think so. Here's what the problem with that hit was: the Philadelphia police arrested the wrong guy in the beginning, a guy named Neil.
Right, Neil. Right, Neil Farber.
Yeah, and he was on death row. before his conviction got overturned. And and to this day, you can talk to people in law enforcement and even the guys in the underworld who will tell you who the two shooters were that night. But the district attorney in Philadelphia, I think, never wanted to admit they arrested the wrong guy, so they never pursued arresting anybody else for that hit. I mean, it's kind of the, you know,
Wow. So in other words, the two hitters never got.
nope, nope.
Wow. That's interesting.
Yeah. And justice is blind, but also justice sometimes is myopic, and they didn't want to look anywhere else because they didn't want to admit that they were wrong, and when they arrested the wrong guy. And I think you're right, two guys got away with murder. Now, best I can determine, one of those guys has since passed away, but the other is still out there.
Wow. Interesting. Okay. Well, listen, Joe, like I said, George, it's a pleasure having you on. I love your work, and people should definitely check out your work. I love to mention all the books, but there's too many. But does there a website or anything people can go to or anything like that?
Yeah, I've got a website called mobscene.net, and I got a Facebook page. I'm not as good with that social media stuff as other people, but yeah, you could find me out there. I'm out there.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you, George. I really appreciate it.
All right, thank you, Nick. Good talking to you.